The morning sun cut through the Manhattan skyline like a blade, sharp and cold and unforgiving. Madison Sterling sat on the concrete steps of the public library, watching the city wake up around her. Businessmen in $1,000 suits rushed past without seeing her. Women in designer heels stepped around her like she was part of the architecture. Invisible. That's what homeless people become in a city like New York. Ghosts among the living. She was 17, though hunger and hardship had carved years into her face that didn't belong there yet. Her clothes were clean, she made sure of that, washing them in public restrooms when she could. Her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail, neat despite everything. Dignity. That's what her mother had taught her before the cancer took her 2 years ago. You can lose everything, Madison, but never lose your dignity. So she sat with her back straight, her few belongings tucked neatly in a faded backpack beside her, and she watched the world go by. Across the street, Thornton Enterprises rose 73 stories into the sky. Glass and steel. Power and money. A monument to everything Madison wasn't. She'd looked up at that building 1,000 times, wondering what it must be like to live in a world where you never had to worry about where your next meal would come from, where you never had to decide between eating and staying warm. She didn't know that today that building would change her life. She didn't know that inside it, on the top floor, a boy her age was staring out a window, looking down at the street below, wishing he could be anywhere but trapped in his own body. Colton Thornton hadn't walked in 5 years. The accident had happened when he was 12. A skiing trip in Aspen. His father had been on a conference call, barely paying attention when Colton went down the advanced slope alone. The fall had been catastrophic. 3 vertebrae fractured. Spinal cord damage. The doctors had said he'd never walk again, and for once all of his father's money couldn't prove them wrong. Now 17, Colton spent his days in a wheelchair in the penthouse apartment that took up the entire top floor of Thornton Enterprises. His bedroom alone was larger than most New York apartments, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that most people would kill for. But Colton barely noticed it anymore. Beauty means nothing when you're imprisoned. His father, Warren Thornton, had built an empire through tech, real estate, and pharmaceuticals. The man's net worth was estimated at somewhere north of $8 billion. He could buy anything, own anything, control anything. Except this. He couldn't fix his son. Warren had tried everything. The best doctors in the world. Experimental treatments in Switzerland. Stem cell therapy in Japan. Faith healers, acupuncture, hypnotherapy. Nothing worked. The money that could move mountains couldn't make his son's legs move. And so Warren did what powerful men do when they can't control something. He threw himself deeper into work. 16-hour days. Business deals that spanned continents. Board meetings and acquisitions and hostile takeovers. Anything to avoid sitting in that penthouse, looking at his son and facing his own helplessness. Colton had long since stopped expecting his father to be there. The penthouse was staffed, of course. A full-time nurse named Patricia who checked his vitals and administered medications with mechanical efficiency. A physical therapist who came 3 times a week to work Colton's atrophied muscles, keeping them from complete deterioration even though everyone knew it was pointless. A cook who prepared nutritionally balanced meals that Colton barely touched. A housekeeper who cleaned around him like he was furniture. People paid to care because genuine care had become too expensive, even for a billionaire. But none of them really saw Colton. They saw their paycheck. They saw the boss's son. They saw the wheelchair and the tragedy and the waste of it all that money and the kid still can't walk. They didn't see the person inside. The boy who used to love soccer and swimming and running through Central Park until his lungs burned. The boy who dreamed of being an architect, of creating buildings that made people feel something. The boy who now spent his days staring out windows, wondering if this half-life was all he had left. Colton pressed his palm against the glass, looking down at the street below. From this height people looked like ants. Insignificant. Moving with purpose toward destinations that didn't matter. His eyes caught on a figure across the street. A girl sitting on the library steps. Something about her was different. She wasn't rushing. Wasn't buried in her phone. She was just sitting there watching. There was a stillness to her that stood out in the chaos of the morning rush. Even from this distance, even through the tinted glass, he could sense something about her. A quietness. A presence. He wondered what her story was. Down on the street, Madison stood up, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. She'd been sitting too long. The police would move her along soon if she didn't move herself. She needed to find somewhere warmer for the afternoon, maybe the subway station or one of the churches that sometimes let people sit in the back pews. Her stomach growled, a hollow ache she'd learned to ignore. Food could wait. It always had to wait. She'd learned that hunger comes in waves. If you can ride out the first sharp pang, it dulls into something manageable. Something you can live with. She started walking, no particular destination in mind. That's what her days had become. Walking. Staying moving so the cops didn't hassle her. Trying to look purposeful so people wouldn't notice she had nowhere to go. She passed the entrance to Thornton Enterprises, glancing up at the gleaming lobby with its marble floors and security guards in crisp uniforms. A different world. A world she'd never be part of. She kept walking, her worn sneakers silent on the sidewalk, just another invisible girl in a city full of people who'd learned not to see. What she didn't know was that at that exact moment, 73 floors above her, Colton was still watching. Still wondering about the girl with the backpack and the quiet dignity. Still feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. Interest in something beyond the four walls of his prison. He didn't know her name. Didn't know her story. But something about her had caught his attention in a way nothing had in years. And in a city of 8 million people, in a world where their paths should never have crossed, fate was already working to bring them together in a way that would change both of their lives forever. The thing about being invisible is that you see everything. Madison had learned this in her 2 years on the streets. When people look through you instead of at you, they forget. You're there. They forget you have eyes and ears and a mind that's paying attention. She'd learned more about human nature in those 2 years than most people learn in a lifetime. She'd learned that cruelty and kindness often come from the most unexpected places. That the woman in the fur coat will step over you without blinking, but the construction worker eating lunch will offer you half his sandwich. That people are complicated. That survival requires understanding which complications might kill you and which might save you. She'd been walking for about 20 minutes when she noticed the commotion. A crowd was forming on the corner of 53rd and Lexington, that particular kind of New York crowd that gathers when something's wrong but nobody wants to get involved. Madison pushed closer, her small frame allowing her to slip between people. In the center of the circle, an elderly man lay on the sidewalk, his face gray, his breathing shallow and labored. His briefcase had spilled open beside him, papers scattered across the concrete. People stood around with their phones out, some filming, some supposedly calling 911, but nobody was helping. Nobody was touching him. That's what fear does. It freezes people. Madison didn't think. She dropped to her knees beside the man, her hands already moving to loosen his tie. She'd learned basic first aid at the shelter before it closed down, back when she still had a place to sleep. The man's eyes found hers, wide with panic and pain. Heart attack, she thought. Maybe stroke. She spoke to him softly, told him help was coming, told him to stay with her, told him he was going to be okay even though she had no idea if that was true. She elevated his head slightly with her backpack, monitored his breathing, kept talking to him in that calm voice her mother used to use when Madison was scared. The voice that says you're not alone. The voice that says somebody sees you. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later. The paramedics took over with professional efficiency, loading the man onto a stretcher, asking questions Madison answered as best she could. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, squeezed Madison's shoulder and told her she'd probably saved his life. Then they were gone, sirens wailing, and the crowd dispersed as quickly as it had formed, everyone returning to their important lives and their important destinations. Madison stood there for a moment, adrenaline still pumping through her system, then bent to gather the scattered papers. It seemed wrong to leave them there, trampled and forgotten. She collected them carefully, stacking them neatly, tucking them back into the briefcase. That's when she noticed the wallet lying half-hidden beneath a newspaper. Expensive leather. Thick with cash. She picked it up, opened it. The ID showed the man's name was Herbert Chin, age 72, with an address on Park Avenue. There had to be at least $500 in bills tucked inside. Maybe more. Madison stood there holding it, feeling the weight of it in her hand. $500. That was food for weeks. A motel room with a real bed and a hot shower. New shoes. A phone so she could maybe find work. $500 was the difference between surviving and drowning. Nobody would know. The crowd was gone. The ambulance was gone. The wallet had been lying there on the ground and she'd simply found it. That's what she could tell herself. That's what would be so easy to believe. Her hands trembled. Her stomach growled. Every logical part of her brain was screaming at her to keep it, that she needed it more than some Park Avenue millionaire, that survival wasn't theft, that the world had taken everything from her, so why shouldn't she take something back? But she could hear her mother's voice. Dignity, Madison. Never lose your dignity. And dignity meant being able to look at yourself in the mirror. Dignity meant knowing who you were even when the world told you that you were nothing. She closed the wallet and tucked it into her jacket pocket. She'd take it to the hospital. She'd find Herbert Chen and give it back. It was the right thing to do, even if the right thing meant staying hungry. Even if the right thing meant another night in the cold. She started walking toward Mount Sinai, which was the closest hospital, hoping they'd taken him there. The walk would take about 30 minutes. 30 minutes to talk herself out of what she was doing. 30 minutes to wrestle with the angel and demon sitting on her shoulders. But she kept walking. One foot in front of the other. The way she'd learned to survive. The way her mother had taught her. What Madison didn't know was that someone had been watching the entire scene. High above the street, Colton had witnessed everything through his window. He'd seen the man collapse. Seen the crowd form. Seen the girl with the backpack, the same girl he'd noticed earlier, drop down beside the stranger without hesitation. He'd watched her help, watched her care, watched her stay when everyone else just stood there filming. And then he'd seen her pick up the wallet. From his vantage point, he couldn't see what she did with it, couldn't see the struggle on her face, couldn't know the war happening inside her heart. But he'd seen enough to make him feel something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Hope. Not hope that he'd walk again. He'd buried that dream long ago. But hope that maybe there were still good people in the world. That maybe humanity wasn't as lost as he'd come to believe. That maybe caring still mattered. He pressed the button that controlled his wheelchair and turned away from the window, his mind racing. He wanted to know more about that girl. He needed to know her story. Madison arrived at Mount Sinai's emergency entrance 45 minutes later, her feet aching, her breath visible in the cold November air. The automatic doors whooshed open, and she stepped into the fluorescent brightness of the hospital lobby. The warmth hit her immediately, almost painful after the cold outside. A security guard glanced at her, his eyes doing that quick assessment people always did, categorizing her, deciding if she was a problem. She straightened her shoulders and walked directly to the reception desk with purpose. People don't question you when you look like you belong. The woman behind the desk was middle-aged, tired-looking, with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Madison explained that she was looking for Herbert Chen, that he'd been brought in by ambulance about an hour ago, that she had something that belonged to him. The receptionist's expression softened slightly when Madison produced the wallet. She made a phone call, spoke quietly, then directed Madison to the third-floor cardiac unit. Room 312. Visitors were usually restricted, but given the circumstances, they'd make an exception. Madison took the elevator up, clutching the wallet like a lifeline. The cardiac unit was quieter than the emergency room, all hushed voices and beeping monitors and the antiseptic smell that all hospitals share. She found room 312 and knocked softly. A woman's voice told her to come in. Inside, Herbert Chen was propped up in bed, an oxygen cannula in his nose, for lines running from both arms, but his color was better. Much better than it had been on the sidewalk. Beside him sat a woman in her late 60s, elegant even in her obvious distress, holding his hand. Their daughter stood by the window, younger, maybe 40, her face tear-stained but relieved. Madison stepped forward hesitantly and held out the wallet. She explained who she was, that she'd helped him on the street, that she'd found this and wanted to return it. For a moment, nobody spoke. They just stared at her, this skinny girl in worn clothes with honest eyes and a backbone of steel. Then Herbert Chen's face broke into the widest smile his weakened state would allow. He tried to speak, but his wife shushed him gently, then turned to Madison with tears streaming down her face. She stood and pulled Madison into a hug so tight and so unexpected that Madison froze, unsure how to respond. When was the last time someone had hugged her? When was the last time someone had touched her with anything other than suspicion or disgust? The daughter was opening the wallet, counting the money, her hands shaking. $540. All there. Every penny. She looked at Madison with something close to awe and asked if she knew what she'd done, if she understood that her quick thinking had saved her father's life. The doctors had said another few minutes without help and he wouldn't have made it. Madison just nodded, uncomfortable with the attention, with the gratitude, with the way they were looking at her like she was something special when she'd just done what anyone should do. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. Most people hadn't done anything. Most people had just watched. Herbert's wife, who introduced herself as Grace, insisted on giving Madison a reward. She tried to press money into her hands, bills pulled from the wallet Madison had just returned. Madison stepped back, shaking her head. She didn't want money. That wasn't why she'd come. Grace looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, seeing past the worn clothes and the too-thin frame to the person underneath. Then she asked Madison when she'd last eaten. The question was gentle but direct, and Madison's stomach answered before her mouth could, growling loudly in the quiet room. Grace smiled sadly and told her daughter to take Madison to the cafeteria and make sure she ate something. A real meal. Whatever she wanted. It wasn't a request. 20 minutes later, Madison sat in the hospital cafeteria with more food in front of her than she'd seen in weeks. The daughter, whose name was Janet, had insisted on ordering half the menu. A turkey sandwich, soup, a salad, mac and cheese, apple pie, orange juice, coffee. Madison tried to eat slowly, tried to maintain some dignity, but her body betrayed her. She was so hungry, so tired of being hungry. Janet watched her with compassionate eyes and didn't say anything, just pushed the food closer, encouraged her to eat more, to take her time. When Madison finally slowed down, Janet asked her quietly if she had somewhere to stay. The question hung in the air between them. Madison could lie. She'd gotten good at lying, at making up stories that kept people from asking too many questions. But something about this moment, about these people who'd shown her such unexpected kindness, made her tell the truth. She shook her head. No, she didn't have anywhere. Janet nodded slowly, like she'd suspected as much, and pulled out her phone. She made a call, spoke in low tones, then turned back to Madison with a strange expression on her face. She said she might know of something, a temporary position just for a few weeks, but it came with room and board. She asked if Madison would be willing to meet someone, to at least hear about the opportunity. She stressed that there was no pressure, no obligation, but that it might help. It might be exactly what Madison needed. Madison sat there, surrounded by empty plates and the kindness of strangers, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying hope. She'd learned not to hope because hope hurt more than hunger when it died. But sitting there in that cafeteria, warm and fed and seen for the first time in so long, she let herself feel it. Just a little. Just enough to nod yes. What would you do if you found $540 on the street when you had nothing? Would you keep it to survive or return it? Drop your answer in the comments below. The address Janet gave her was for Thornton Enterprises. Madison stood across the street staring up at the building she'd looked at 1,000 times, never imagining she'd actually step inside. Janet had explained during the taxi ride over, paid for without hesitation, that her father Herbert had done business with Warren Thornton for 30 years. They weren't exactly friends, powerful men like that didn't really have friends, but there was respect there. Trust. And Warren had a son who needed help. Not medical help, he had plenty of that. He needed something else. Something money couldn't buy. Someone real. Someone who gave a damn. Janet had made a call from the hospital, cashed in a favor, spoke to Warren directly. She'd told him about Madison, about what she'd done, about the wallet and the choice she'd made when she had every reason to make a different one. Warren had been skeptical at first, Janet admitted that honestly. He'd been burned before by people who saw his son as a paycheck or a story to tell at dinner parties. But Janet had insisted. There was something different about this girl. Something genuine. Something Colton desperately needed even if he didn't know it yet. Warren had finally agreed to a meeting. Just a meeting. No promises. Now Madison stood in the marble lobby feeling entirely out of place. The security guard who'd waved Janet through with a smile looked at Madison like she might steal the furniture. Janet placed a protective hand on Madison's shoulder and guided her to the private elevator that led to the penthouse. The ride up was silent except for the soft mechanical hum. Madison watched the numbers climb. 48, 53, 61, 70, 73. The doors opened directly into the penthouse apartment, and Madison's breath caught. She'd seen wealth before, glimpsed it through restaurant windows and hotel lobbies, but she'd never stood inside it. Never felt the weight of it. Warren Thornton was waiting in the living room. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with silver hair and the kind of presence that came from decades of people doing exactly what he said. His suit probably cost more than most people made in a month. His watch definitely did. But it was his eyes that struck Madison. Tired eyes. Sad eyes. The eyes of a man who had everything except what mattered. He looked at Madison the way everyone looked at her, with that initial assessment, that split-second judgment. But then his expression shifted into something more complicated. Janet had vouched for her, and Janet's word carried weight. He thanked Janet, who squeezed Madison's hand once before leaving, promising to check on her in a few days. Then it was just Madison and Warren, standing in that enormous room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its view of a city that had never cared whether Madison lived or died. Warren got straight to the point. His son needed companionship. Someone his own age. Someone to just be there. Talk to him. Sit with him. Help him remember what it felt like to be human instead of a medical condition. The staff took care of his physical needs. This was different. This was about his soul, though Warren didn't use that word. Men like Warren didn't talk about souls. The position would be temporary, maybe a month, maybe longer depending on how things went. Room and board provided. A private bedroom with its own bathroom. 3 meals a day. And payment, he named a figure that made Madison's head spin. More money than she'd seen in her entire life. Warren watched her face carefully as he laid out the terms. There would be a background check, standard procedure, though Janet had already explained Madison's situation. He knew she was homeless. Knew she had nothing. He said it matter-of-factly, without judgment but without pity either. Just stating facts. The question was whether she could do this. Whether she could handle being around someone who was broken in different ways than she was. Madison found her voice, asked what happened to him. Warren's jaw tightened. Skiing accident 5 years ago. Spinal injury. Paralyzed from the waist down. The best doctors in the world had tried everything. Nothing worked. But the real injury, Warren said quietly, wasn't to Colton's spine. It was to his hope. The boy had given up. Stopped trying. Stopped caring. He spent his days staring out windows at a world he couldn't be part of anymore. Warren had thrown every resource at the medical problem and ignored the human one. He could admit that now. Could admit he'd failed his son in the ways that mattered most. He asked Madison why she'd returned the wallet. He wanted to know what made her different. What made Janet think she was special. Madison stood there in her worn clothes in that palace of wealth and told him the truth. She'd returned it because her mother had taught her that dignity was the only thing nobody could take from you. You had to give it away. And she wouldn't give hers away for any amount of money. Even when she was starving. Even when she had nothing. She was still herself. Still the girl her mother had raised. Still someone who knew right from wrong even when wrong would have been so much easier. Warren studied her for a long moment. Then something in his face softened, just slightly, like a wall developing its first crack. He told her he'd like her to meet Colton. Right now if she was willing. No commitment yet. Just meet him. Talk to him. See if there was any connection there. Madison's heart was pounding. She'd agreed to come here, but the reality of it was suddenly overwhelming. What did she know about helping people? What did she have to offer a boy who had everything except the one thing he wanted? But she thought about Colton staring out those windows, trapped and alone, and she thought about herself on those library steps, invisible and forgotten. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Maybe loneliness looked the same whether you were rich or poor. Maybe that's exactly why she was here. She nodded. Warren's expression was unreadable as he led her down a hallway toward Colton's room. Colton's room was at the far end of the penthouse, separated from the rest of the apartment by what felt like intentional distance. Warren knocked twice, a courtesy that felt rehearsed, before opening the door without waiting for an answer. The room was massive, almost obscenely so, with those floor-to-ceiling windows dominating an entire wall. The view stretched across Manhattan like a postcard, the kind of sight that should take your breath away. But Colton wasn't looking at it. He was facing away from the window toward the door, his wheelchair positioned near a bookshelf lined with volumes that looked untouched. His face registered surprise when he saw his father, then confusion when he noticed Madison standing slightly behind him. Warren's introduction was brief and awkward, the words of a man more comfortable negotiating billion-dollar deals than human connection. This is Madison Sterling. She's going to be spending some time here. Keeping you company. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that felt like abandonment. Colton and Madison stared at each other in the sudden silence. He was handsome in that polished way wealthy kids often are, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that might have been warm once but now held nothing but suspicion and exhaustion. He looked her up and down, taking in her second-hand clothes and her worn sneakers, and something bitter twisted his mouth. He asked what she was, some kind of charity project. His voice was sharp, defensive, the voice of someone who'd been paraded in front of too many specialists and therapists and well-meaning strangers who all promised to help and never did. Madison felt anger flash through her, quick and hot. She'd spent 2 years being looked down on, being dismissed, being treated like she was less than human because she didn't have a home. She wasn't about to take it from some rich kid in a wheelchair who had everything except gratitude. She told him flatly that she wasn't anybody's charity project, that she was here because his father asked her to be, but that she could leave just as easily. His problem, not hers. The honesty seemed to surprise him. People didn't talk to Colton Thornton like that. They talked around him, above him, about him, but never directly to him with that kind of unfiltered truth. He blinked and some of the defensiveness faded. He asked who she was then, if not some paid companion hired to make him feel better about his pathetic life. Madison walked further into the room uninvited and sat down in the chair near his bookshelf. She told him the truth. All of it. About her mother dying. About losing their apartment. About the streets. About being invisible. About Herbert Chin and the wallet and the choice she'd made. She didn't dress it up or make it prettier than it was. She just laid it out like facts on a table. Colton listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something she hadn't expected. He said at least she could walk away. At least when the world got too heavy she could move. Could go somewhere else. Could choose. He was trapped here in this room, in this chair, in this body that didn't work anymore. Everyone felt sorry for him. Everyone wanted to fix him. But nobody understood that he didn't want to be fixed anymore. He just wanted to not exist. The words came out raw and honest, the kind of honesty that only happens when you've hit bottom and have nothing left to lose. Madison understood that feeling. She'd been there herself plenty of times, sitting in the cold wondering if it was worth waking up the next morning. She told him she got it. That she wasn't here to fix him or feel sorry for him. She didn't have it in her to feel sorry for anyone. She'd used up all her pity on herself a long time ago. But she was here and he was here, and maybe they could just be two people who understood what it felt like when the world didn't want you anymore. No therapy. No inspirational speeches. Just honesty. He could take it or leave it. Something shifted in Colton's expression. The wall didn't come down completely, but a window opened. He asked what she did all day when she was on the streets. She told him about the library, about watching people, about making up stories about their lives to pass the time. About finding beauty in small things because the big things were too painful to look at directly. A perfect cup of coffee someone left on a bench, still warm. Sunrise over the East River when she'd been up all night. A kid laughing. A dog wagging its tail. Moments that didn't cost anything but meant everything. Colton listened like he was hearing a language he'd forgotten he knew. He wheeled himself closer to the window and asked her to describe what she saw when she looked at the city from down there, from street level. Not the view from up here where everything looked small and manageable and fake. The real view. The one that mattered. Madison stood and joined him at the window. She pointed out the library steps where she'd sat that morning. The corner where Herbert had collapsed. The church that sometimes let her sleep in the back pew. The bodega owner who occasionally gave her day-old bread. The subway grate that blew warm air in the winter. She showed him her city, the invisible city that existed underneath the one he could see, and for the first time in 5 years, Colton looked at Manhattan and saw something other than his prison. He turned to her, and there was something different in his eyes. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But maybe the possibility of hope. The smallest crack in the darkness that had swallowed him whole. He asked if she'd come back tomorrow. Not because his father was paying her. Just because. Madison looked at this boy who had everything and nothing, who was broken in different ways than she was but broken nonetheless, and she recognized something in him that she saw in herself every time she caught her reflection in a store window. The will to survive, buried deep but still there, still fighting. She told him yes. She'd come back. Sometimes the people who have everything are the loneliest of all. Have you ever felt invisible even when surrounded by others? Share your story below, you're not alone. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Madison would arrive each morning around 9, let in by the housekeeper who'd stopped looking at her with suspicion and started offering coffee. She'd spend hours with Colton talking about everything and nothing. They didn't follow any structure or plan. Sometimes they'd sit in silence, both of them comfortable with quiet in a way that people who've been alone understand. Sometimes they'd talk for hours, conversations that wandered from books to music to philosophy to the small observations about life that only matter when you're paying attention. Madison told him about her mother, really told him, not just the facts but the feelings. The way she'd sung while cooking. The way she'd never complained even when the cancer was eating her alive. The way she'd held Madison's hand at the end and told her to be brave. Colton told Madison about the accident. Not the medical details, he'd recited those enough times to enough doctors. He told her about the fear. About waking up and not being able to move and thinking he was dying. About the months of false hope, of treatments that promised miracles and delivered nothing. About watching his father's face slowly transform from determination to defeat to absence. About the moment he'd realized he was going to be like this forever and deciding that forever wasn't worth living. He'd never said those words out loud before. Never admitted to anyone that he'd thought about ending it. But Madison didn't flinch. Didn't give him platitudes. Just listened and understood because she'd had those same thoughts on cold nights when survival felt harder than surrender. On the 5th day, Madison brought him something. A small smooth stone she'd found by the river, worn perfectly round by water and time. She placed it in his hand and told him it was a worry stone. When things got too heavy, you held it and remembered that even the hardest edges eventually smooth out if you give them enough time. Colton turned it over in his palm, feeling its weight, its smoothness, and something inside him cracked open. He asked her why she cared. Why she kept coming back. Why she wasted her time on someone who couldn't even walk. Madison looked him straight in the eye and told him that being able to walk didn't make him worth caring about. Being human did. And he was still human even if he'd forgotten. That night after Madison left, Colton did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He prayed. Not to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Not for a miracle he didn't think would come. He just spoke into the darkness and asked for strength. For purpose. For a reason to stop staring at windows and start looking at his life. He held the stone Madison had given him and felt something shift inside his chest. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the seed of it. The possibility that maybe his life wasn't over. Maybe it was just different now. Maybe different didn't have to mean worthless. The breakthrough came on the 8th day. Madison arrived to find Colton agitated in a way she hadn't seen before. His physical therapist had just left, and the session had been particularly frustrating. The woman had pushed him to try certain exercises, movements that were supposed to maintain muscle tone, and Colton had barely cooperated. Madison asked him why he didn't try. He exploded then, words pouring out in a torrent of anger and pain. What was the point? Why maintain muscles that would never work? Why pretend there was hope when every doctor had said the same thing? Why torture himself with the fantasy that anything would ever change? Madison let him rage, let him pour out all the poison he'd been holding inside. When he finally fell silent, exhausted and ashamed, she spoke quietly. She told him about a man she'd met on the streets. His name was Daniel and he'd been homeless for 7 years. He had one leg, lost to diabetes and poor medical care. Every morning she'd watched him pull himself up on his crutches and start his day. Collecting cans. Asking for work. Refusing handouts unless he'd earned them. She'd asked him once how he kept going. How he stayed positive when life had taken so much. Daniel had laughed and told her that life hadn't taken anything. It had changed things, sure, but he still had his mind and his heart and his ability to choose how he responded to what happened to him. The leg didn't define him. His response did. Madison told Colton that she'd thought about Daniel every single day since her mother died. Every time she wanted to give up. Every time the cold or the hunger felt like too much. She'd think about a one-legged man on crutches who refused to stop moving forward. Colton was crying. Silent tears running down his face. He asked her what she wanted from him. What she expected. Madison moved closer and took his hand. She told him she didn't want anything except for him to try. Not to walk. Not to be fixed. Just to try to live. To engage with his therapy. To stop punishing himself for something that wasn't his fault. To understand that his life had value exactly as it was right now, wheelchair and all. That he could still create. Still think. Still connect. Still matter. That maybe the miracle he was waiting for wasn't about his legs working again. Maybe it was about his heart starting to beat again. Something broke in Colton then. Some dam he built to hold back 5 years of grief and rage and despair. He sobbed, and Madison held his hand and let him. Didn't try to fix it, didn't try to stop it, just witnessed it, just stayed. When he finally quieted, he looked at her with eyes that were raw but clearer than she'd ever seen them. He asked her to stay tomorrow when the therapist came. To be there. To help him try. Madison squeezed his hand and promised. That night, for the first time since the accident, Colton Thornton fell asleep without wishing he wouldn't wake up. Bloco 7, 900 palabras resoluco e impacto. The physical therapy session the next morning was different from the beginning. Patricia, the therapist who'd been working with Colton for 2 years, noticed it immediately. He was present. Actually present. Not just going through the motions with dead eyes and limp cooperation, but engaged. Asking questions. Trying. Madison sat in the corner of the room, and every time Colton's face twisted with frustration or pain, every time she saw him wanting to give up, she'd catch his eye and nod. Just keep going. You're doing it. You're trying. That's enough. Patricia worked his legs through range of motion exercises, stretched his atrophied muscles, pushed him harder than she had in months because for the first time he was actually responding. Halfway through the session, she had him transfer from his wheelchair to the parallel bars, something they hadn't attempted in over a year. Colton's arms shook with effort as he held himself up, his useless legs dangling beneath him. Patricia supported his weight from behind while Madison stood at the end of the bars, her presence somehow making the impossible feel possible. Patricia instructed him to try bearing weight on his legs, not to walk, just to feel the sensation of standing, of his feet touching the ground. Colton closed his eyes and concentrated. He'd done this exercise 100 times in the first year after the accident, always with the same result. Nothing. No sensation. No movement. Dead weight. But this time something was different. This time he wasn't doing it because doctors told him to or because his father was paying someone to make him. He was doing it for himself. For Madison. For the possibility that life might be worth living even if his legs never worked again. He bore down, putting weight through his legs, feeling Patricia's hands supporting him, feeling the strain in his arms. And then something happened that nobody expected. His right leg trembled. Not much. Just a flutter of muscle, a tiny spasm that could have been nothing. Could have been involuntary. But it was something. Patricia gasped. Her professional composure cracked as she called out for him to do it again. To try again. Colton's eyes flew open, meeting Madison's across the room. She was standing now, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. He tried again. Concentrated with every ounce of will he possessed. And his right leg trembled again. Stronger this time. Undeniable. Patricia was crying now too, calling for the nurse, calling for Warren, her voice high and urgent. Colton couldn't speak. Couldn't process what was happening. His leg had moved. After 5 years of nothing, his leg had moved. Warren burst into the room minutes later, his face pale with fear that something was wrong. But Patricia was laughing and crying at the same time, explaining what had just happened. Warren looked at his son, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. Colton was still gripping the parallel bars, exhausted and shaking, but his face was alive. Actually alive. Not the dead mask Warren had grown accustomed to. His son was in there. Fighting. Trying. Living. Warren's knees nearly buckled. He moved forward and placed his hand on Colton's shoulder, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The doctors came. Ran tests. Did examinations. They were cautiously optimistic but realistic. The movement didn't mean Colton would walk again. Spinal injuries were unpredictable. Sometimes nerves that seemed dead could regenerate partially. Sometimes the brain found new pathways. Sometimes miracles happened slowly, in increments too small to measure until suddenly they weren't. The key was continued therapy. Aggressive therapy. And most importantly, Colton had to want it. Had to fight for it. That was the real miracle. Not the muscle movement. The fact that Colton Thornton had decided his life was worth fighting for. Over the following weeks, the progress continued. Small victories that felt monumental. A toe wiggle. A knee flex. Sensation returning to parts of his legs that had been numb for 5 years. The doctors cautiously upgraded their prognosis. With intensive therapy and time, Colton might regain partial mobility. might be able to stand with assistance, might even take steps with braces and support. No guarantees, never guarantees, but possibility. That word that had been dead for so long suddenly had a heartbeat again. Through it all, Madison was there. She'd moved into the penthouse full-time, her small bedroom becoming the first real home she'd had in 2 years. Warren had stopped seeing her as temporary help and started seeing her as the person who'd given him back his son. Not physically, though that was happening too, but emotionally, spiritually. The real Colton, the boy who'd been buried under 5 years of despair. Warren found himself talking to her sometimes, late at night when Colton was sleeping, asking her how she'd done it, how she'd reached him when nobody else could. Madison always said the same thing. She hadn't done anything except see him. Really see him. Not the wheelchair. Not the tragedy. Not the waste. Just him. The person. That's all anyone ever wants. To be seen. 3 months after that first therapy session, Colton stood on his own for 15 seconds. His legs shook violently. His arms windmilled for balance. Patricia and another therapist were right there ready to catch him. But he stood. Warren watched from the doorway, tears running down his face, his phone forgotten in his hand. And Madison stood across the room, her hands clasped together, whispering words that might have been prayers or might have been wishes or might have been the simple truth. You did it. You're doing it. You're alive. The homeless girl who'd had nothing had given everything to the boy who'd had everything but had lost himself. And in saving him, she'd somehow saved herself too. That's how miracles work. They don't come from where you expect. They come from the last place you'd look. From the people you don't see. From the connections that shouldn't exist but do anyway. From the understanding that we're all broken in different ways, and sometimes the broken pieces fit together in patterns more beautiful than anything that was never shattered. The people who save us are often the ones we'd never expect. Sometimes a stranger's kindness can change everything. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that miracles are real, and that hope can come from the most unexpected places. Drop in the comments if you believe in second chances and the power of human connection.